Yes, Steve.
I just read a book, Rebooting the Bible, which agrees with what Ben said, saying that at 100 AD, there was a conspiracy to get rid of 1,300 years to confront Jesus being the Messiah, and that's what got adopted into the Masoretic Text, that the Septuagint is most accurate. And plus, if you use the date of Josephus, the Exodus, it agrees with what the Septuagint dates when you add it at 1600, which agrees with all archaeology of the destruction of Jericho and the surrounding cities.
Well, thank you for that. I would just say that when you read Old Testament commentaries on Genesis, I think that I've never seen anyone yet disagree with the priority of the Masoretic Text. Everyone seems to think that I've read, and I've read quite a few, that the Septuagint text, that's the Greek text of the Old Testament. That's not the original language. That's a Greek translation. And then the Samaritan text of the Pentateuch, everybody seems to think that those numbers have been changed because of these difficulties. But as Ben and you indicate, everything is open for discussion.
William Lane Craig says here that out of all the commentaries that he's read, and he's read quite a lot, he has never come across anyone who favors the genealogies in the Greek Septuagint over the Masoretic. They all seem to agree that the Septuagint's numbers are altered and that the Hebrew Masoretic text is original. That's odd. I'm surprised that someone as educated as William Lane Craig has never heard of Josephus or Eusebius. Josephus was a very prominent first-century Jewish historian, and when he lists off the genealogies in his work called The Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus includes the extra 100 years on 6 generations, which agrees with the Greek Septuagint. Now, Eusebius was a very prominent 4th-century church historian, and when he lists off the genealogies in his work called the Chronicon, Eusebius favors the Greek Septuagint. He says, "Let us now proceed to the times after the flood." He says, "Our Septuagint text and this Samaritan Hebrew text are in harmony regarding the number of years each man lived prior to fathering a son." He says they both diverge from the Jewish Hebrew version by 650 years. Notice how he says 650 years. That's an extra 100 years on 6 generations and an extra 50 years on the 7th generation. Now, look at what he says about the Hebrew Bible. Now, he's in the 4th century. He says the rational conclusion is that the figures provided in the Jewish version are in error. That's the Jewish version of the 4th century after Christ. He goes on and he says it is obvious that the Hebrew Jewish version is incorrect. And he goes on. He says it is possible to show that the Jewish version is unreliable. And then he finally concludes and says, "Thus it is patently clear that the Septuagint was translated from old and accurate Hebrew copies and is the most appropriate text for us to use in our present chronicle." Notice how he says that the Septuagint was translated from old and accurate Hebrew copies. It's not the original Hebrew, but it was translated from the original Hebrew. And he goes on and he says, especially since the Church of Christ, which has spread throughout the world, supports only this version. And since the apostles and disciples of Christ used and transmitted this version. So the church of his day only trusted the Septuagint. They did not trust the Hebrew text of the unbelieving Jews who had rejected Christ and rejected the gospel. And William Lane Craig says here that he doesn't know of anyone who favors the Septuagint's chronology over the Hebrew Masoretic.
I've never seen anyone yet disagree with the priority of the Masoretic text. Everyone seems to think that I've read, and I've read quite a few, that the Septuagint text, that's the Greek text of the Old Testament. That's not the original language. That's a Greek translation. And then the Samaritan text of the Pentateuch, everybody seems to think that those numbers have been changed because of these difficulties.
Really? He's never heard of Josephus? He's never heard of Eusebius? You know, Theophilus of Antioch was a 2nd century church father. He includes the extra 100 years on those 6 generations. He agrees with the Greek Septuagint. There was also Julius Africanus, a 3rd century church historian. He includes the extra 100 years on those 6 generations. He sides with the Greek Septuagint. So what do we have here? We've got a 4th century church historian. We've got 2nd and 3rd century church historians and a church father. And we've got a 1st century Jewish historian. All of these guys agree with the Greek Septuagint, but William Lane Craig has apparently never heard of any of these guys. So pay no attention to the men behind the curtain.
Close that curtain. I don't want to see it. Even in my peripheral. Huh? Snap it. Snap it shut.